So we're very delighted to have Polly join us today. Thank you, Polly.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute delight to be here. It's certainly a conference that I'm looking forward to hearing from other speakers. After hearing the previous speaker discuss where the potential of the future world is going, I do ask for your forgiveness if I forget something. Until I have a proper trip, I'm very busy. It's sometimes one of these things that very often I can run far faster than what I'm trying to say and do, and there's a presumption of knowledge. So what I'm going to do is maybe speak for about 35-40 minutes and allow space for questions. One of the problems with being a lawyer is that lawyers always presume that your audience are way ahead of you anyway, and you possibly are. Law is essentially a way of governing society, and law can be used for good purpose as well as bad purpose. Sometimes we have laws in place that worked initially, but then over a period of time we see that actually the outcome creates greater problems in the long term. So law in itself is a living being. It's not a perfect being, like humans as well. But it's also something that changes and evolves over time. And I had gotten to a part of my journey as a barrister in court when I was beginning to realise that there was something very wrong within our legal system, where we had so normalised mass damage and destruction that I was representing corporations and good people within these corporations who thought it was perfectly fine to make a lot of money out of systems that cause mass damage and destruction. Now, for me, that really bothered me. Why was it that people I got on well with, that were perfectly intelligent, did not seem to have an issue with this? What was going on here? And when I started to examine this, when I discovered that, in fact, law had caused the problem in some ways. It is the law to put profit first, without looking to consequences. So CEO and directors of a corporation, their number one legal duty is to maximise profits for their shareholders. This worked very well for quite some time. In fact, our whole kind of industrialisation and our movement, our advancement in commerce has been driven very much by that premise, not just in the UK, but right across the world. But we have gotten to a stage now that we have mass damage and destruction playing out in such a way that law hasn't allowed us to examine consequences and prevent, preempt, and prohibit it. So in a way, what I'm looking at is how we can use law to change the system, to change the rules of the game of how we engage in life itself. And this led to one of those kind of light bulb moments that sometimes happen when you end up going down a rabbit hole of inquiry. You get to a point and someone says something or you hear something and it kind of wakes up the thought. And 3-4 years ago, when I was actually on a stage in Copenhagen at the climate negotiations, discussing how we could expand the concept of human rights to earth rights, someone in the audience happened to mention that we need a new language to deal with what's happening here, that here we have mass damage and destruction playing out every day, and surely it needs a new language to deal with this. And of course, in legal terms, that means maybe a new law. And I found myself thinking, this is like genocide. It's ecosystems, it's ecocide. That should be a crime. And it was one of those moments where the light bulb goes on, and thinking, yes, it should be a crime. Why is this not a crime? And could this work? And that took me down a rabbit hole of very deep legal inquiry of putting the idea to strict, rigorous scrutiny. Could we make ecocide an international crime? It took me 3 months to come back out of the rabbit hole and say, yes, we can. And what's more, this is a very practical solution to a huge problem that is creating an endemic system that has knock-on impacts in many, many ways. And so I'd like to take you through explaining what this law could be and the implications this can have for our future. And also to talk a little bit about leadership, because I believe that it will take a brave, moral, bold, courageous leadership to stand up and say, yes, now we need to close the door and make ecocide a crime. When I was researching this, what I did was I went back into first principles to look at what do we already have in existence in terms of international crime. And we already have 4 international crimes. And you'll know of some of them at least. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Those 3 international crimes were put in place after World War II. Crimes of aggression, the precursor to the run-up to war, in fact, was just signed off just recently in 2010. These are collectively known as crimes against peace. And the crimes against peace are put in place to protect the well-being of life, predominantly human life. So there was a recognition, we got to a point of understanding within civilization that mass killing of humanity should be a crime. Hence we have genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. Prior to 1948, genocide wasn't actually a crime, interestingly. And in fact, that word wasn't largely well known either. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to stand up against something that had been normalized? And in fact, in certain countries, there were laws in place to say that it was perfectly fine to kill many, many people. So this is how sometimes the power of law can shift our understanding. It can act as an incredible lever for change within civilization as to what we consider to be a norm, or what we decide should not be the norm. But I see that there's a missing 5th crime against peace, and that's ecocide. And this is about expanding our cycle of well-being, health and well-being, not just human-to-human engagement, but humans to all beings. Because if we look at mass damage and destruction of any given territory, it's not just humans that live in a given territory. We're also looking at various species. We're looking at the land itself. We're looking at the waterways. We're also looking at the adverse impacts that can play out for future generations as well. And that's very important, and I'll come back to that. This is a slide that really arose out of the kind of scribble on the back of an envelope when I was trying to make sense of how is it that we seem to have a hermetically sealed cycle of damage and destruction that's spiraling onwards and upwards out of control. And how it starts with causing damage and destruction, which can lead to, amongst other things, resource depletion, which can lead to conflict and then to war. And in fact, Sir David King, who you will hear from later today or tomorrow at this conference, he said that we're looking at a century of resource wars. We've already had a war over water, which was Darfur, we've had a war over oil, Iraq. But I say it needn't be that way. We can, instead of slowing down that cycle, we can halt it, we can disrupt it. And this is where a law of ecocide comes into its own. Now, you'll have heard of the term disruptive technology. Disruptive technology is when technology comes in quite literally left field, and it changes everything around very, very fast for us. And in fact, it shifts our values as well. A very good example of disruptive technology is the internet. If you look at how that's changed our lives just in the last 10 years, it has changed everything beyond all recognition of how we even envisaged 10 years ago. And I believe that a law of ecocide has the same capacity to change the way we actually live life itself and engage on it. This cycle of damage and destruction, we have it mapped, we have it charted, we have evidence that we are spiraling onwards and upwards and faster. The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report, which came out in 2010, put a figure on the damage and destruction in the year 2008 by the top 2,000 corporations, and that figure which you heard earlier, $2.2 trillion for 1 year. It's a huge figure. What does that mean? Well, to give it context, only 7 nations' GDP that year exceeded that figure. So that's a huge amount of damage and destruction that's not being remedied, not being restored, not being put back in place. It's estimated in 2009 it will be almost double, $4 trillion. 2010 double again. So somewhere along the line, exponentially, this is going faster and steeper. It's like one of those hockey stick graphs that just goes onwards and upwards and upwards. So it's really about how we stop that system. It's spiraling out of control. And that's where the proposal that I've made into the United Nations, this was submitted into the UN Law Commission back in April 2010. These are the beginnings of the definition, comes into play. And what I've proposed is that we criminalise mass damage, destruction to our loss of ecosystems of a given territory. And there are 2 different types of ecocide at play here. I'll come back to that. But possibly the most important word in this definition is the word inhabitants. In fact, clicking on it to make it red makes it darker rather than lighter. But I hope you can see that. It's not humans. It's not just about the diminution of our peaceful enjoyment. Peaceful enjoyment is a legal term in its own right. But it's to do with all who live in a given territory. So this is about expanding the cycle of concern. And the recognition that there is an interconnectedness to life itself. Destroy the very earth that we stand on, we destroy our ability to live in peaceful enjoyment. Now, as a child, I grew up fearing bees, running away from bees. We were told bees are a bad thing. They sting you, kill them. So either I was running away or I was chasing them. In fact, we had under the eaves of our home a beehive, and we spent a lot of time irritating them with a stick and then trying to kill them or running away from them. They don't aggravate us. Now my understanding of bees is very different. When that very same report, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity report, highlighted the fact that over 70% of our foodstuff is dependent on the pollination by bees. We lose our bees from colony collapse disorder, and we lose our ability to feed ourselves quite literally overnight. Now, that report, the Ecosystems and Biodiversity report, put a price tag on what it would mean to the economy to lose our bees for a year. And it was an enormous figure, which was very instructive because you see this is going to be very damaging for our economy if we lose our bees. But I'd say it goes further than that, because it's not just about finding the money to shore up the economy. Once we lose 70% of our ability to have foodstuffs because of bees, it's ad infinitum, it's there on in. We have to work out different systems. And no amount of money is going to bring back a pollination system of an extinct species. So it's about recognizing the sacredness of life itself, that in and of itself, it is so important to actually give back into life rather than take life away. And that has huge implications for how we actually engage with the world at large, how we do business. So there are 2 types of ecocide here. One is human-caused ecocide, and examples of that are mining, fossil fuel extraction, fracking, deforestation. Just literally 3 weeks after I proposed into the United Nations the law of ecocide, we had the BP Gulf oil spill playing out in real time. And that really gave fire to the proposal because the word ecocide itself, it's actually been around since the 1970s. It's just not a very well-known word in Western societies, but it's very well known in Latin America. Ecocidio is something that's very really playing out daily there. And what I discovered was that I had a huge amount of engagement by international journalists when they discovered that here was a lawyer back in the UK proposing that we make it a crime. That has triggered an enormous amount of activity over the last 2 years now, where the proposal itself has taken me all over the world, discussing this with governments, with international lawyers, with faith leaders, embassies, ambassadors. The engagement is growing daily. and the recognition that, yes, morally, we have to close the door to this, and that maybe then we have to put the law in place that gives governance to that moral recognition that it is wrong to cause mass damage and destruction. Now, I'm not anti-corporations, not at all. In fact, I'm very pro-business. But what I'm very keen to do is close the door to business that is causing or creating profit that arises out of mass damage and destruction. What is very important here within a corporate context is that it's not about intent. We don't have CEOs and directors sitting down rubbing their hands together and saying, what shall we destroy today? It's not how it works. It ends up being signed off as collateral damage. But what we do have now is a situation where sometimes in a boardroom you will have someone sitting there saying, actually I feel uncomfortable about the fact that our activity is causing mass damage and destruction. Now that causes real problems because you will have a director or a CEO turning around and saying, yes, but at the end of the day we have to maximise our profits. At the moment the international legal, the legislative framework is not there to close the door to this. When Lord Brown decided to go beyond petroleum, he failed for a number of reasons. And one of them was that he didn't have the legislative framework in place so that he could continue to maximise his profits to the shareholder without causing mass damage and destruction. By trying to go into renewable energy, trying to move into clean energy, he was not going to maximise his profits because, quite frankly, there wasn't law there that would prioritise that. Our existing law prioritises that which we have very well established and which has served us very well until this time. Now, there's a second type of ecocide here, naturally occurring ecocide. Sometimes it's also referred to as ecocide that's caused by climate change. Actually, it doesn't really matter whether or not you believe that we have tsunamis, mountain ice floods, rising sea levels as a result of climate change. What matters is the fact, the evidence that we can have mass ecosystem collapse. Now, of course, you can't prosecute BP for rising sea levels in the Maldives, but what we can do is impose a legal duty of care on nations to give assistance. At the moment in climate negotiations, we have 54 small island states, and not just small island states, other countries like Bangladesh that are looking at rising sea levels. In fact, Bangladesh has a triple whammy, rising sea levels, melting ice and floods. So they have huge environmental refugee issues that are looming fast on the horizon. The dialogue, the narrative as to what do we do here just isn't taking place. Quite literally, governments are saying that's not my problem. By creating an international law of ecocide, we can impose a legal duty of care on nations to come together and decide what assistance has to be put in place beforehand. And that's very important. We don't just leave it for the disaster to strike and then step in. So this is about looking to consequences of outcoming. Now, this is a slide obviously that shows a corporate ecocide. But what I'm wanting to do here is make the problem into the solution. That is absolutely crucial. How do we turn this around? I'm not interested in closing down huge transnational corporations because that would be very damaging to our economy. In fact, what I want is large transnational corporations to use their skill base, their wherewithal, their ability to move fast to create innovation in a very different direction. And that's where law can be very, very powerful because by giving that framework, then it prioritises where you have to go and it closes the door to where you can no longer go. International crime also has two principles that are very important here. The first one is the principle of responsibility, and this was set out in the Nuremberg war trials, where it recognises that crimes are committed by human beings, not the abstract entity, not the fictional person. Because that's what a corporation is. It's a fictional entity. It's known in the law as a fictional entity, fictional personhood. Of course, you're very limited as to what you can do with a fictional personhood. At the end of the day, a fictional personhood is just a piece of paper. It's the articles of association, it's the charter of that corporation. There's no point putting a piece of paper in prison. That is a waste of time. So usually what we have are limited recourse to solutions, and it's usually fines. Problem is with fines is that fines are catch me if you can laws. You end up having to litigate, often for many, many years, and actually if you do succeed, then the payout is very often too little too late. So this is about using international criminal law to impute responsibility on the human beings. Well, which human beings is that? That's those who are in a position of superior responsibility. Those who are, if you like, at the top end of the, if you have a diagram, you have very few people at the top end making a decision that can have adverse impact on many millions below in the triangle. This applies to international criminal law. It's also known as the command and control principle. So those who are in a position to make decisions that can have impact on the lives of many. That means CEOs, directors. It also means heads of state, ministers of state. Those who make decisions about where our lives will go. It also means heads of banks, because this is about finance, the flow of finance, the flow of money, where money is invested. At the moment, the flow of money is invested in a lot of damaging, disruptive activity. That is the norm. But when we close the door to it and we say, okay, it is now a crime to invest in mass damaging, disruptive industrial activity, then the flow of money goes into innovation in a very different direction. So this is also about how we facilitate investment, research, innovation, and how we accelerate it, how we trigger the transformation to, in essence, the green economy. We have a human right to life already in place. In fact, in Europe, what we have is a European Convention on Human Rights. Article 2 sets out our human right to life. It parallels the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, under our human right to life, here in Europe, we already have case law that's well established to say that states have a positive legal duty to ensure that our lives are protected. But it goes a step further here in Europe. We actually have case law that says that where our human life is put at risk of injury or loss, then member states have a legal duty to close down dangerous industrial activity. What constitutes dangerous industrial activity? Well, within the context of climate negotiations, what we're seeing now is that reports are coming through from established institutions. The IEA, the OECD have both brought out within the last couple of months heavyweight reports that conclude that on existing international law and governance and policy, business as usual is prioritising fossil fuel. And if we keep on going down that road, then we're looking at an increase in temperature of between 3 and 6 degrees by the end of the century. Now, in Copenhagen at climate negotiations, it was decided, the one thing that did come out of climate negotiations then, when everything else collapsed, was an agreement by virtually all countries, 191 countries to be exact, that anything over 2 degrees increase in temperature constitutes dangerous. So if we're going ahead and continuing with existing industry that will take us higher than that, then we have dangerous industrial activity at play here. So this is about, actually already here in Europe, we have a legal duty of care to close the door to this. And I say that that's a very powerful, persuasive legal argument that applies not just here in Europe, but actually applies right across the world. It's a moral obligation that has been recognised in law as a legal obligation. So even without a law of ecocide, just on human rights, our human right to life, we have a duty to make sure that we look after our lives and future lives, and that which is threatening future lives and our current lives should be treated as dangerous. But it is more than that, because it's about how we view the earth. And this is about how we fundamentally shift and how law can fundamentally shift how we engage upon our viewing of the earth itself. View the earth as a thing, and what happens is we commoditize it, we put a price tag on it. It can be bought, it can be sold, it can be used, it can be abused, because there's no need to look at the consequences. That's all about the law of property. I own. And I see that the scales of justice are imbalanced here. They need to be remedied. Because this is about shifting our understanding, and understanding the earth as a living being. And when we do that, we recognise that it has intrinsic value, rather than just an imposed value. Putting a price tag and saying it's an ecosystem service only takes us so far. It's actually about saying, no, there's a legal duty of care here. We need to take our responsibility, and that transposes into law, as putting in a law that imposes a legal duty of care. That's also about looking to trusteeship laws. It's about understanding that we have a stewardship role, a guardianship role. It also means that when we do that, that we create a relational context to how we engage with what's happening with the earth, rather than a disconnect. One of the problems we have with just treating the earth as a thing, as a commodity, is that we become very disconnected. And we can see that playing out when we're looking at how do we maximise our profits, annual returns, quarterly returns. We now have day traders whose sole job is to maximise profits on a trading floor within a 24-hour period. Now that trader is not going to look to the consequences of what that activity that business is playing, is engaging in. But if we have in place new laws that are based on trusteeship principles, then we start to look at the consequences. In fact, what we do is we prioritise people and planet over and above profit. Now, I'm not anti-profit, not at all, but when we prioritise people and planet, what happens is that profit can flourish and arise out of something that is non-damaging and non-destructive. And that's what's so key here. I'd like to take you back 200 years ago, because I think there are remarkable parallels to what happened then as to what's happening now. What was truly incredible then was that civilization got to a point where we said, morally, slavery is wrong. We need to close the door to this. And it was William Wilberforce, who was the big parliamentarian here in the UK, who stood up to speak out against this. Now, William Wilberforce recognised there were three very crucial things that needed to happen. One, you had to pull the subsidies. Slavery was very heavily subsidised. Two, you outlaw it, you criminalise it. You put in a new moral imperative. You make the moral imperative into a legal imperative. And three, you create new subsidies. Now, that was very important for me to understand this when I was researching Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, because William Wilberforce was not anti-business. In fact, one of his greatest friends was a gentleman called Charles Grant, who was the director and chief executive of one of the largest corporations at the time, which was the British East India Company. And the British East India Company had an awful lot of involvement, as you can imagine, in the slave trade. But what William Wilberforce recognised was that the moral imperative trumps the economic imperative. And when he stood up and spoke out, and not just him, the Quakers as well were very instrumental in this, and many others who did stand up and speak out with him, was that it was a moral imperative that drove the need for change here. Now, of course, when he stood up and spoke out, big business responded with a wall of objection. And they said, you cannot get rid of slavery. It's a necessity. The public demanded it. But more than that, get rid of slavery and we will have economic collapse. And instead, industry proposed various solutions. They said, leave it to us and we'll deal with this in a voluntary capacity. We've already got too many laws. Why should we have another law to deal with this? We can ask people to use their slaves a little less. Now, obviously that wasn't where Wilberforce was coming from. He was saying in and of itself slavery is wrong. But more than that, industry said if the push comes to the shove, then leave it to market forces to resolve this. We'll limit the numbers, we'll cap this, and we'll create an internal trading system so that we can benefit from this. A form of cap and trade was actually proposed. But more than that, there was a suggestion that we should improve conditions. A little bit of hay for the bedding as they come over on the boats. Now, given that over 2/3 of slaves died on boats, it wasn't the hay, the bedding that was going to make a difference. Wilberforce stood very strongly and said, no, it's the moral imperative that must trump the economic imperative here. Now, the amazing thing is that those laws were put in place 2 days before he died. He died a happy man. But what is so incredible is to compare back then with now. And it was 300 companies that were either directly involved or indirectly involved with the slave trade or the secondary industry, which was the sugar monocrop plantations. But today, what we're looking at, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity Report identifies 2,000 corporations that are involved in mass damage and destruction. It's a different form of enslavement. The picture you're seeing here on the left is actually of the Athabasca tar sands in Canada, one of the largest, most hidden ecocides in the world. That's a toxic tailing pond. It's where the toxins are dumped into ponds. The ponds themselves can run to several hundred kilometres in length. So it's not really a pond, it's not fair to call it a pond, it's more the size of an enormous lake. And there are many of them. Now this land that's being destroyed, the expansion plans are, if they proceed over the next 8 to 10 years, an area the size of England and Wales combined, 45,000 square kilometres. And for what? It's ancient arboreal wetlands and forests that are being pulled up for unconventional tar extraction. For want of 20 to 40 years energy, we lose an enormous amount of our ecosystems that in fact we are dependent upon surviving, because actually they are huge natural carbon sinks in their own right. And of course, the fossil fuel industry, heavy extractive industry, are coming up with objections to saying this must stop. And those objections are exactly the same objections. And the proposals that are being put forward, unlike in Wilberforce's time when they were rejected, we've tried. We've tried cap and trade. We know it doesn't work. It's collapsed here in Europe. It's problematical in many other countries. We're seeing that actually we've got an escalation in damage and destruction, not a reduction. So leaving it to market forces hasn't worked. So this is about, okay, well, how do we think outside the box? How do we move forward with it? Just as William Wilberforce said, no, we close the door to it. We literally turn the tap off upstream. And by doing that, by saying we can no longer do that, we outlaw it, we forbid it, we then open up the floodgates to something else to come and be put into its place. And the beauty is that if I, go back a slide, is that in the day of William Wilberforce, when slavery was abolished, not one of those 300 companies collapsed. And that's because it was well managed, and that's very important. They were given subsidies, they were financially assisted so that they could go on and start trading in innovation in another direction. Some of them actually became the policers of the seas, so you get poacher turns gamekeeper. But the important thing was that the economy didn't collapse because it was well managed, and that was something that William Wilberforce was very keen to see happen. Now, when I was initially researching a law of Ecocide to see if it would work, I actually had a look to see what do we have in place during wartime, and what I discovered was that we already have an international crime that prohibits mass damage and destruction to the environment. But during peacetime, we can do it all the time. So what I'm dealing with here is really a legal loophole that needs to be filled. But what is very interesting here, this arose out of the Vietnam War, when it was recognised that going in and using agents white, blue and orange was so hugely damaging and destructive that in fact we needed to close the door to it. And I think we've come to a similar point now that we need to close the door to mass damage and destruction during peacetime. What is very interesting is often when we take a word and we can transpose it. In law, we sometimes do that. We take law from over here, we put it over there. Change the word here, instead of military advantage to community advantage. You can look at something like the Athabasca sands and say, well, who are the community? It's not just the shareholders, that's your corporate community who benefit from it. But what about the land? How does the land benefit from this? How does the water benefit from this? How does the indigenous community benefit from this? And certainly how does the future generations benefit from it? This is also about how we measure this. Well, during wartime we measure it, we say mass damage and destruction is measured because we look at size, 200 kilometres more, duration. Is this going to adversely impact for a season or more? The recognition that if it knocks out a season's worth of environmental nature's engagement of an ecosystem, then you're possibly looking at far longer term adverse impacts playing out. But also impact, severity of impacts. Does it adversely impact on human, economic, natural resources? It doesn't have to have a price tag on it. It's also about the fact that we have already some very important pieces of hardware in place. We have the International Criminal Court. That was just put in place in 2002. First scheme started just a few years later. But what we're seeing is that we have an International Criminal Court which allows us to take action far faster. Now, it's not a perfect system, and it's certainly a piece of hardware that's in desperate need of an upgrade, but it's very powerful, because prior to that, we didn't have an international court. It's all well and good having laws, if you can't police it and house it, then there are problems in its own right. So for me, this is about shifting away from a predominance of property law. It's not about getting rid of property law altogether, but putting it in the balance, where we also balance it with trusteeship law. And when we bring in an international crime of ecocide, really what you're doing is you're giving governance that imposes criminal sanctions, but it allows to protect the rights of all beings, literally the right of the life of the planet itself. And that's very crucial here, because ultimately what we're doing is we're expanding our health and well-being out to all inhabitants. And what I discovered when I was researching this is that, in fact, this is a very ancient tenet of law already. We've just forgotten about it. It's known as the sacred trust of civilization. And it dates back in written records back to the 16th century. It's now embedded in our first successful international legal document, the United Nations Charter. And it sets out how members of the United Nations, the interests of the inhabitants, that word inhabitants, is paramount. Number one is that we look after the health and well-being of all who live here. It doesn't say humans, it doesn't say heads of state, it doesn't say corporations. But actually it is a sacred trust that we hold as human beings to the rest of the world. And this is also about using existing trusteeship council. It's one of the pieces of hardware that we have in the UN. We can put that back to good use. There is a room, somewhat like this one, in the United Nations that actually seats 2,000 people. And we can use this by creating a law of ecocide, where governments can come together to decide what do we need to do to give help and assistance to areas that are adversely impacted by ecocide, whether or not it's naturally occurring or human caused. That room in the United Nations is actually closed at the moment because it was put in place originally to deal with ex-colonies, non-self-governing states they were called. Once we got rid of colonies, there was a period of transition, a recognition that once you take out a nation who's governing a colony, you need to help and give assistance while they transition into a state of self-governance again. Well, when you're hit by a mass ecocide, you become non-self-governing. So we can use an existing piece of hardware here. We don't have to invent how, where we have to get together for it. So in summary, what I'm saying here is that ecocide really is a crime against humanity, it's a crime against nature, it's a crime against future generations, and ultimately a crime against peace. And this is really a tale of how one thought can actually take you down a rabbit hole, and it can lead to something far bigger. It's an idea of its time. I had no inclination whatsoever when I proposed this into the United Nations, how this would start taking across the world, and how that engagement is going every single day. But it is more than that, it is about leadership. And this is really about us recognising that there are consequences to our actions and our decision making, both within our work context, political context, and actually on an individual context as well. How we engage on what we see to be solutions to move forward in this. So we put out an advert. Please don't know. We are literally looking for visionary business leaders to stand up and speak out. Because this was the interesting thing back in the time of growing milk for us. There was one man who did stand up and speak out, and that was Charles Grant. Charles Grant, the big CEO of this time, he stood up and he said, the moral imperative trumps the economic imperative. What was truly remarkable about Charles Grant was that he seemed to lose so much by standing up and saying, I support the fact that we need to outrun slavery. He stood to lose his status, he stood to lose an awful lot of money, he stood to lose his business. But he stood up and he did that. And when he did that, two remarkable things happened. One, many other leaders then stood up and spoke out as well. He gave permission to others to do the brave, bold, courageous thing and stand up and speak out and support it. And two, governments acted. And they then stood up and said, yes, we have to do this. The moral imperative trumps the economic imperative, and those laws were put in place. And we've done it again in history, not just for the abolition of slavery, but if you look at the civil rights movement and the ending of apartheid. Again, it was a moral imperative. We recognise that in and of itself it was wrong, and that we needed to close the door to it. So we're looking for our Charles Grant, and we do ask you to go onto the website, whoscharlesgrant.com, and nominate a leader. We think that we need to bring this to business leaders' attention and say, please, help us, biggest job on earth, let's get these laws into place. Thank you very much.